Up here. Okay, so tonight we are thinking about teaching from the wisdom literature. That's that little section of books right in the middle of the Old Testament. Basically, we're talking about Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. But the Psalms are so unique that they kind of deserved their own treatment. So that's why we talked about those last week. But these other books are, well, they're not even necessarily all that similar in how they're put together. If you think of like the book of Proverbs versus Job, for example, in Job especially, you get past chapters 1 and 2, and then it's just this collection of long speeches. Whereas in the book of Proverbs, you get these short, pithy statements that are, sometimes barely even 10 words long. So, not a lot of similarity in in the structure of these books per se, but there is similarity in the goal of these books. Maybe that's the best way to put it. They're trying to give us wisdom to live life with skill so that we can know how to navigate life with skill and not run our lives aground on the hidden sandbars of sin, we might say. Oh, I like that metaphor. That's pretty good. That'll preach right there. But that's what these books are trying to do. So we'll take a look at these books here one at a time. Kind of think about them one at a time, and I'll give you some tips on either teaching from these books, or if you're going to maybe refer to one of these books as you're teaching somewhere else, there's some things we might want to keep in mind. All right, so let's think about Job first here. I already mentioned how there's such a difference in that book between the first two chapters that tell us the story of Job's misfortunes, right? So we just have, a pretty straightforward telling of a story in those first two chapters. And so, as we mentioned when we talked about teaching Old Testament stories, we'd want to keep all those same lessons in mind. Look for the story elements in there: plot, drama, suspense, the climax of a story, the resolution of the story, all those sorts of things, those good storytelling elements. But then, the structure of the book takes quite a change after that as we get into those long speeches. So, most of the time, if people are going to teach from the book of Job, most of the time people are just going to be covering those first two chapters and not necessarily getting into some of those longer speeches. I imagine if let's say you're teaching Sunday school and using a curriculum, unless maybe it's an adult curriculum, they're probably not going to get into kind of that longer middle section of the book. So this tip here might be more relevant for instances where you're teaching on something else or from another part of the Bible, but maybe you want to refer to a quote that's found in the book of Job. So what you want to make sure you do is take note of who is speaking and assess the statement carefully. I'll write those up here for your fill-ins. Take note of who is speaking and assess the statement carefully. Now, why is that? Well, because we have multiple speakers throughout much of the book of Job, right? We've got Job, we have his three friends who came to try to comfort him, but really kind of just wound up accusing him instead. And then we have the younger man, Elihu, at the end. And why is it that we want to take such careful note of who is speaking? Well, because think about this. At the end of the book, from what you remember, did God compliment Job's three friends for what they said? Or did he critique them, kind of criticize them for what they said? Yeah, he critiqued them, right? He criticized what they had to say to Job. And that was mostly because they were essentially prosecuting Job based on half truths. Okay, they really didn't say anything in their speeches that was just completely wrong and false. The problem was that they were only operating off of a partial view of the whole truth. Yes, they were correct that sin brings sin brings bad consequences into your life, but they weren't willing to consider that connection doesn't necessarily go in the opposite way. In other words, they weren't willing to consider that bad consequences don't always mean that you committed sin. And they just refused to consider that as Job protested his innocence. And so we got to keep that in mind then when we're reading the book of Job, and especially, again, if you were going to use a quote from Job to maybe illustrate something that you're teaching from another passage, we want to make sure we think about, okay, was this coming from Job's three friends or Elihu? Okay, if so, I need to think about this a little bit more. Make sure that if there's a need to kind of maybe balance out what they're saying, maybe I need to provide some of that balance for my students as I refer to this. So we should ask ourselves, how can I make the best use of this quote? Do I need to frame this for my students somehow? Do I need to add a little explanation in here? Okay, so just an important thing for us to remember and keep in mind there. All right. What about the book of Proverbs here? What about the book of Proverbs? Well, let me just give you the first tip here, and then I'll explain what's behind that statement. All right. So, tip number one here: consult many different proverbs on the same topic. Consult many different proverbs on the same topic. Now, when you're teaching from the book of Proverbs, especially chapters 10 through 31, that's where we find just the collection of the short statements, that we typically think of when we think of Proverbs. The first 9 chapters do contain some sections that are a little bit longer, speeches from Solomon to his son that are a little bit longer. And so we do have the possibility there of just sort of zooming in on, one of those sections and kind of focusing on that. But when we get into chapters 10 through 31, where we just have the collection of short statements, we're going to want to look at many different proverbs and what many different proverbs have to say about a certain subject. This kind of goes against the grain of the advice I gave you in some of the earliest sessions. I think sessions 1 and 2 in particular. I think especially number 2, if you had a chance to watch that recording that I did after I had to miss that week because I was sick. But one of the things that I've encouraged you to consider, especially if you're creating your own lesson, is to try to find one central passage and stay there mostly, and bring all the focus and attention onto that one central passage, rather than necessarily hopping around quite a bit. But Proverbs is the exception to that rule. And the reason for that is because oftentimes, if you study a certain topic in Proverbs, different Proverbs are going to kind of fill out your understanding of that topic. So that if you study a bunch of different Proverbs on that, you're going to have a more well-rounded understanding of what the wisdom, what the advice is going to be on that topic. You'll find clarification of maybe other Proverbs that aren't quite as clear. Sometimes we do encounter a proverb that makes us scratch our head a little bit, and we think, well, why would it tell me to do that? That seems a little bit odd. I need some clarification. So other proverbs might give us clarification. Sometimes other proverbs will even give you wonderful illustrations to use, depending on the topic that you're talking about. As I was thinking about this earlier, the proverb deals with laziness. And the one that came to mind was the proverb about the man who's so lazy that when he reaches his hand into the food dish, he won't even lift it up to bring it to his mouth in order to get the food into his mouth. It's meant to be just a completely ridiculous picture of laziness, but that's the idea. It's supposed to be so ridiculous that we laugh, and then we think, oh, have I ever acted like that before? Yeah, I probably haven't done that exact thing, but man, if I've really, yeah, there you go. Never been lazy with food. No, you got a pretty good incentive, to kind of bring the food up there. But maybe at the tail end of Thanksgiving, maybe I've done that before. But no, it's just the idea of making ourselves think, oh man, if I've let laziness take control, then boy, I'm acting just as foolish as that. And so, as you consult different proverbs, you can even get some great illustrations there. So, all right, and then second one here: consult different translations. Consult different translations of the same proverb. The book of Proverbs creates a big challenge for translators as they're trying to translate from Hebrew into English, because those are just such short statements without larger context. And it's context that tells us what a word means in a particular statement. You just think about how different it would be. Okay, let's imagine that I was handing something to you, and I said, "Take this over to the bank." Now, the context would make a huge difference there. Okay, if I was handing you checks, well, that would communicate one thing. But if I was handing you a tackle box, that would communicate something different about what kind of bank I'm talking about, right? And it's context that makes all the difference, because the word bank by itself doesn't tell you which of those banks I might have in mind. Or, imagine if you were taking pilot lessons, you're taking flying lessons, and your instructor says, you're up in the air 5,000 feet off the ground, and your instructor says, bank left. Well, because of the context, he's not warning you that there's some kind of brick building floating in the cloud to your left that you need to watch out for. He's saying, turn left, right? Or, angle left. But again, the word bank, like if you walked in here earlier and I had the word bank written on the board, you wouldn't really know which of those ideas I was going to talk about, because the word all by itself won't tell you. It's the context. And that's how we figure out what a word is supposed to communicate in a statement. And so anytime we find a statement that has very little context to it makes it that much harder for us to figure out what what the word is supposed to communicate. And so that's why sometimes, and you'll notice it if you would look through a number of proverbs and look them up in different translations. Sometimes you run across different translations that seem remarkably different, and you think, wow, what's going on here? I mean, this translation expressed it this way, and this translation expressed it in a fairly different way. Well, that's why they're trying to communicate the meaning of those terms without a lot of context to help guide them. Okay, so consulting different translations, well, for one thing, that could actually help you get a better understanding of the proverb, because a different translation might use a different English word in the translation, and that might actually make it more clear for you. But consulting different translations will also clue you in to a situation where maybe you need to explain something to your students about why different translations put it a different way. That's probably not so vital if, for example, you're teaching from a curriculum, or maybe they've received a handout, like in Sunday school or something, and they're all just looking at the handout. They're probably not looking at their own different translations. But in settings like adult Sunday school or other settings where your students are looking at their own whatever translation they have with them, then that might be a setting where if you are referring to a certain proverb and trying to make a real point about it, you'd better check it out in a few of the most common translations, so you can see if you need to clarify anything for your students about why their translation might possibly be somewhat different from yours. Okay. All right. How about Ecclesiastes? This book that you all are probably just dying to teach. You probably just can't wait to crack open Ecclesiastes with your students, right? this book that often has the stereotype of being so, such a downer and rather pessimistic. Yes, I know none of us are too eager to teach from this, but if you find yourself trying to tackle this challenge, here's a tip for you: read widely in this book to get the big picture. Read widely in this book to get the big picture. Because there are statements in Ecclesiastes that can sound very weird when they're taken out of context. One example, I think, would be the one I put on your handout here. Chapter 7, the first part of verse 16. Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Now, taken out of context, that sounds really weird, doesn't it? I mean, isn't it good to be righteous? Isn't it good to be wise? And like, can you really be overly righteous? Like, is that really a concern? Why does he say something like that? Well, when we look at the context of that, we find out that what he's saying is essentially that even righteousness and wisdom provide us no guarantee of a long life. He immediately before that, he makes the observation that, he's seen righteous people, wise people die young, and he's seen wicked people live long lives. And so in light of that, that's why he makes this statement. So, if we somehow were going to convince ourselves that, pursuing righteousness and wisdom is going to make us immune from an untimely death or something, well, we'd be wrong. We'd be barking up the wrong tree. And so that's why he makes this statement, that we shouldn't get caught up in the pursuit of righteousness and wisdom for that misguided reason of thinking that we can somehow, completely insulate ourselves from death in that way. Now, here again is where, even with this advice, it helps us to read widely in this book, because he does tell us in other places that righteousness and wisdom do provide some advantage against death. They do provide some advantage for avoiding an untimely death, but they don't provide us with an ultimate advantage against death. I hope that does that distinction make sense? They give us a relative advantage, not an ultimate advantage. In other words, yes, if you live a righteous and wise life, you will probably avoid bringing calamity on yourself. But there are many factors in life that we don't control. So even righteous and wise living does not ultimately give us, an escape from death. But you can probably see how, man, if we take just isolated statements from this book, it can sound really strange and sound like it's giving us really weird advice. So that's why we need to make sure to keep things in context there and read widely. In fact, if you were going to, teach on Ecclesiastes in any length or any depth, really, it would be helpful to get a good grip on the whole book first. Even before You know, if you were going to tackle it, kind of going through from beginning to end, you'd want to get a good grip on the whole book before you start that, because it's important to get the big picture of what Solomon is trying to say in that book. All right. The last one here in the wisdom literature, the Song of Solomon. All right, what's my tip for you here? Don't write off this book. Don't write off this book. You were hoping I was going to say, don't touch this book. Yeah, you were hoping I was going to say, don't teach from this book, right? You were hoping I was going to say, don't even think about it. Don't even consider it. But no, actually, my advice, my encouragement to you as teachers is just the opposite. Don't write off this book. In other words, don't tell yourself that this is completely out of bounds for me. I would never be caught dead trying to communicate anything from this book. Don't just make it out of bounds for yourself, okay, before you might think about it. Now, why do I say that? Why do I say that? I really just say that. I know that you'd probably sooner try to tackle Ecclesiastes than you would Song of Solomon, perhaps. But why do I say this? It's because of both an observation and a conviction that I have about the usefulness of this book, especially in our present cultural setting. Okay? Because ask yourself this: why is the biblical sexual ethic so vilified today? Why is promoting monogamous heterosexual marriage so vilified? It seems like absolute common sense to us. Because we've had our thinking on sexuality shaped by scriptural teaching. But why is it so vilified? It's not because the biblical view of sexuality has been proven wrong. In fact, exactly the opposite is the case. We have all the facts on our side. There is just no doubt whatsoever that a monogamous heterosexual relationship is the healthiest way for both body and soul to engage this part of your life. All the facts back that up. Physically, that is the healthiest and the safest way to engage in sexuality. We can almost completely eliminate the risk of sexually transmitted diseases if we conduct ourselves according to biblical parameters. And that's just objectively true. The facts are on our side. Not only that, but this is the safest for the soul, the safest way to guard our mental health in this area, we might say. The safest way to avoid many of the negative drawbacks that come from promiscuity. And again, that has been proven through social science studies. Those who report the greatest contentment in this area of their lives are those who live by a biblical sexual ethic. So why is it vilified? It's not because it's false. It's because it's portrayed as ugly. It's because people portray biblical sexuality as hateful, as what's the word? Repressive, dangerous. That's what we're told today, right? If you promote a biblical sexual ethic, it's going to be dangerous to those who live a different way and who experience, depression and all those things as a result of the way that they live. That's what we're told, right? We're told that the biblical sexual ethic is ugly rather than beautiful. And so, what is the one book in the Bible more than any other that shows us the beauty of biblical sexuality? It's the Song of Solomon, isn't it? It's the strongest tool in our arsenal to push back against the exact point of attack against the biblical sexual ethic today. And yet it lies almost completely undiscovered in people's Bibles, right? And so that's why I don't want anyone to just write off this book, um, because of its awkwardness, potential awkwardness, in anything like that. Now, of course, yes, we've got to be thoughtful about the appropriate venues for talking about Song of Solomon, or studying that book. Certainly, some venues, some contexts, some gatherings would not be, the appropriate place to study that, or to consider what it has to say. But that doesn't mean that no such contexts exist. And so I think we need to, um, man, I think we need to use the beautiful picture of that book to help people see, no, what the Bible has to say about sexuality is beautiful. It's attractive. It's desirable. It's not ugly. It's not harmful. It's not repressive. It's beautiful. It's something that we ought to desire, and that book helps us to see that and to do that. So anyway, that's my little soapbox spiel about the Song of Solomon there and its relevance. So again, the context in which you teach right now might not be the place to crack open that book. It certainly is a context specific kind of consideration when we would think about teaching that book. But it's something that we shouldn't just automatically put out of bounds before we've thought about it. So, all right. Any observations, comments, questions before we wrap things up tonight?
Well, just to be clear, when you say consult different translations, does that mean like NIV or King James, New King James?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. When I was talking about consulting different translations,
I wouldn't
that's
understand Greek. I wouldn't understand Greek at all.
no. Yeah, I'm talking about, yes, like you mentioned, NIV, ESV, New American Standard, King James, New King James. Um, all of the more regular, more common English translations. Yep. Mm-hmm. What else? Any other questions, comments?
It's sure nice that consulting different translations these days is so easy with,
Oh yeah.
instead of having to have like find a different copy of all these different ones and have them spread out all over, you can just scroll down.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yep. We live in a golden age of being able to just pull up lots of different translations at the same time, and yeah, we are lousy with resources, and so we ought to put that to our advantage. Any other thoughts? One of these days, I'm gonna settle in my own mind on the right setting to teach the Song of Solomon around here. I haven't quite settled on what that setting is going to be, but one of these days, I want to do that. So, all right. Well, thanks for coming tonight, and hope you have a good rest of your evening.